Good evening, everyone. We are back in Habakkuk Chapter 3. I trust that we would have a chance to go through the first two chapters again. And now in Chapter 3 is actually the response of Habakkuk as he has made his petition, and then he has heard what God is doing. And the things that we have read in chapter 2, 1 and 2, and how God responded is, I would say, it would be astounding. And interestingly, in this particular chapter, as he closes, he begins with a prayer. It says a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet. And I trust that as we go through this particular chapter, there are a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. I mean, I would look at it this way. You probably may have another way, but this is what I would do, is to go through the words, find out what it means. But in chapter 3, it has a different character. And the character is that, number one, it's a prayer. And in Hebrew prayer, many of these prayers are coming from the angle of what we call in our modern day a hymn, where it is phrased in a song. And the Hebrew prayers are repeated prayers. So they document it. And in this particular one, Habakkuk is actually writing his response. And it's in the style of a song. And hence, you need now to read chapter 3 as a response of who Habakkuk is, who he represents, the just, and also those who follow after God in this particular book, as he appeals to God and God has responded. And I would submit to you that Habakkuk would have digested the things that God has said. He was told to write down his vision, and so he did. And at the conclusion would be this chapter 3. Now in chapter 3, it says a prayer. And as I had mentioned, prayer in itself, tefillah, is an intercession. He intercedes on behalf of Judah, the nation of Israel. And in a prayer in this particular instance, it is also what we would call a hymn. So a hymn or a prayerful hymn of Habakkuk the prophet. And you realize that prophet is not just any ordinary people. A prophet would be a Navi, a man of God, a spokesperson of God, a person who is special from God. And as we can see, God had an exchange with him in this book. And he appeals to God on behalf of the people. Now, we have a strange word here, shigionoth, as it is in English. It would be shigionoth. Shigionoth. It appears once in, I think, Psalm chapter 7 as a title, right? As a title. And in a way, you find that this word only appears twice in the Bible. Once here in Habakkuk chapter 3, and then in Psalm chapter 7. And it comes in this particular form. If this word means a rambling, meaning Habakkuk is coming out and saying whatever comes to his mind, that would be the theme of this hymn. Now, some other Jewish commentators think that he is reflecting on his errors. I think not. I think this would be a particular style of his prayer, that he's coming out and he is reflecting on the things that comes to his mind. And the last thing I want to leave with you as we think of chapter 3 is this. because it is in a form of a prayer, which is a song in a form of a hymn, you need to then look at this particular chapter not so literally, but literal in its meaning, but not literal in the wordings, because the wordings will bring out the what we would call the imagery. It is poetic. And once it's poetic and imagery, you would find that we will lose a lot of things in translation. In Hebrew songs, like psalms, right? This is like a psalm. They do have rhythm and rhyme. Unfortunately, you can't translate rhythm and rhyme from Hebrew to English. So we would lose that part of it. I'll try to highlight to you some of the repetitive, similar sounding words. But more importantly is to capture the imagery and the poetry of this prayer of Habakkuk. That would be as best as we can achieve today. So let's begin in verse 2. It says, "O Lord," and this one, I think all of us will recognize that Habakkuk knows whom he is speaking to. Right? That's important. And he says, "I have heard your speech." There is a particular, these two words need a bit of explanation. One is the Hebrew word for hear. Here is Shema. You would have heard this repeated many times that Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4 is often called Shema. And that comes from the word hear, right here. And to hear in Hebrew literally means to pick up the sounds from your ears, to process it in your head, to understand what is said, and then to make a decision how you would respond. So it is an all-encompassing word, and hence we have the modern English word called obey. Is very often used to translate this word. Now the speech here is a bit challenging. The word speech here also has a play of the sound of Shema, but you would find in we could call it a report, something that God has said, but it's coming out from a more poetic form. And I think in Psalms chapter 150 verse 5, you would find that the sound of God's words come across in the Psalms as a loud noise. And in Psalm chapter 150, verse 5, it comes across as a clanging cymbal, a loud clang. And this is how Habakkuk is expressing it. So I'm just trying to explain to you from that viewpoint that it says, "Oh Lord, I have heard your loud voice, and I was afraid." And the word afraid here would be, to fear God, and this would be terrified. It uses some very common words, but it actually paints a picture. And Habakkuk is terrified of what he has heard. And if you remember, he has heard the things that is said in chapter 1 and 2. And so he says, "Oh Lord, revive your work," the things that God will do in the middle of the years. I would say on the onset, it is not possible. I don't know the meanings of some of these expressions, but I would give you my opinion. You could research it out as well. This would be in the years of trouble. That would be my guess of it, right? That he's praying to God to revive the work of God in the middle of the years of trouble, in the middle of the years, to make it known, and to make it known to the people. And the last line here, "in wrath, remember mercy." Now, this is how Habakkuk understands God. The word wrath here does not mean wrath. Okay. The word wrath in this case means a trembling. How would you say? A trembling out of fear or anger. That's how it's described, right? A sense of trembling in anger. And so God, please remember. Remember means to bring to mind. Bring to mind what? And this is a very key word, rachem. Rachem in itself means mercy. It's translated as mercy. I think it's, in this case, it should be translated as compassion. Compassion would be a good way to define this, because it is in the time of trouble when God is judging that he would remember to have compassion on the people that he is judging. And that would be how this is expressed in this way. And hence, as you go through this very quickly, as I go through from here on, you would realize that it has a composition of how Habakkuk understands God. Now, you may look at it from an application as how we would look at God and pray to him. And so I would leave that to your application as you study. But I just want to show you how Habakkuk expresses it to God. And so that would be how Habakkuk is looking at God. That while God is angry, he appeals to God to bring to mind his compassion, that it needs to come out. Now, the word mercy is racham. And that is the expression of love coming out, not the modern day heart, but the bowel or the womb of a woman. That would be compassion, and that's how the parts of the body is used in this way. So now, very quickly, we will go through the rest of this chapter, and so you could see the imagery, and not so much that we would fix ourselves in too many of the words. All right. So here goes. God, and you must know the word God here is Elohim. And by Elohim means the mighty one. The mighty one came from Teman, and this is south. This also has to do with Edom, Esau, by the way, Teman, and that would be the southern part. Okay. Then the next phrase is the Holy One, the Kadosh, right? The Kadosh. And in this case, it would be used as a noun. The one who is holy comes from the Mount of Paran. And by Paran, this would be also further south or further southwest, southeast, where Ishmael was living. And so these are expressions that you would find in the Old Testament with regards to Teman and Paran. Where do you find this? I think you would find this in Genesis, right? As well as in Deuteronomy. And somehow they always remember that God was with Esau and as well as with Ishmael. And they are all related to each other. And this is how the expression comes. The mighty one came from the south, Teman. The Holy One came from Mount Paran, right? Which is Ishmael's area. And then comes this particular word, Shelah. Shelah appears numerous times in the book of Psalms. And it means a pause. That's what it is, a pause. So you take a pause here. And it says, his glory covered the heavens and the earth was full of his praise. One of the things you find in Hebrew expression is this: heaven and earth. Heaven and earth, and that would mean the skies and the land. It is always in these pairs, Hashemayim and Haaretz, would be how everything in this world is composed of. His glory in this case would be the splendor, the majesty of God. It covers the skies. That is how it means. It covers the skies. And then the earth was full of his praises. The word full, it also means in a way to be well covered. Right? So you would find this would be an A and a B, says the same thing twice and expresses the glory and the praise of God, the splendor and majesty of God. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Now, all of these are very graphic, poetic words that describes God. And this may give us an idea of when God was in the Mount Sinai as he gave out his laws, but it's a description of how Habakkuk describes God. The brightness, the illumination was like light and order, that you could see how God has done things. He has rays flashing from his hands, and this word is horns in some of your Bibles. I think you would find the horns very interestingly. The word horns is found in many parts of the Bible, and horns are found in the corners of the altar. But in this case, it is not literally horns. Horns gives a symbol of power, but in this case, horns would be similar to Exodus 34. Let me just put this down. Exodus 34. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, his face shone with horns. And basically, it means that he's got a face, right? And shone like horns would be brilliance. These are called horns. And so his rays flashing from his hand would be very much his hand. And then we are talking about the horns that's coming out. And that would be light that is radiating out. And these would be horns. Okay, that's how we would be seeing this passage. And so his power was hidden, and all these are all about power. Now, the other part that we are seeing here is this. The first one we saw was Raham, which was translated as mercy or compassion. In verse 4, we have another part of a body, which is hand. And by hand, you must understand that in Hebrew, hand is a symbol of authority or power. And so verse 4 speaks of that. And verse 5 continues, before him went pestilence. Now, pestilence in our modern day would be a plague. It is a sense of reordering things. It causes chaos and re-establish the base again. The word fever, how should we call fever? It's not fever in our modern day word. It would be, I think a better word would be lightning bolt. Okay, lightning bolt. Followed at his feet. All these are with regards to the powers of God. Okay, powers of God. Verse 6. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains are scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. And all this describes also with regards to the power of God, with regards to judgment. And we would understand earth as the land, the nations were there, mountains would be governments, hills would be smaller powers. By the way, his ways are everlasting would be the worlds, the process of the worlds. And this would be God's way of ruling the world. It would be for a long time. I saw the tents of Cushan. Cushan would be North Africa. And the curtains of the land of Midian, one is afflicted, one tremble, and both talks about fear of God's judgment. Cushan would be North Africa. Midian would be northwest Arabia, I would say, northwest of Arabia. So now we get to verse 8. Verse 8 continues, O Lord, you were displeased with the rivers, your anger against the rivers, your wrath against the sea. You rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation. Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. These depicts God's judgment as it sweeps across the land. And so this would be reminiscent of how God would have dealt with Israel, more so with the northern kingdom, perhaps, right? The northern kingdom. And remember, we spoke about the northern kingdom, and this would be overthrown by the Assyrians, and it would be Sennacherib, right? Sennacherib. And you divided the earth with rivers. So very imagery driven, very picturesque, right? Very picturesque. The mountains saw you and they trembled. The overflowing water passed by. The deep uttered its voice, lifted its hands on high. Again, hand, if you see the word hand, it would be a symbol of authority. But in this case, it would be representing a matter of surrender. Okay? Humbling before God. And this is also considering with regards to judgment. And is a reflection of the judgment of God. The sun and moon stood still where they are. The light of your arrows, they went. Lightning, the shining of your glittering spear. All these are with regards to the description of God's powers. You marched through the land in indignation and trampled the nations in anger. As this judgment of God swept through the land, it reminds Habakkuk of how King Sennacherib would be the king that came to attack the northern kingdom. Right? That would be the picture that God was using Sennacherib to judge the northern kingdom. Verse 13, you went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. Now, I think something needs to be mentioned here. I would want to mention this. The word anointed and your people. This will be God's people. Remember, Habakkuk is appealing and intercessing on behalf of the just of Judah, the just of Israel. And so he says, you, God, you went forth for the salvation. The word salvation here would be deliverance. Your anointed would be the one whom God has anointed. It is Mashiach. Commonly in our English word, Messiah. In the New Testament, you would have Christ. Christos, okay? Christos. That would be the equivalent word. And so at this point in time, we're not talking about anything too far in the future. It would be how God has delivered his anointed. And by the way, the word Mashiach or the word anointed uh, deals with anyone who has oil poured over his head. For example, when Aaron, right, when Aaron was appointed the high priest, he was anointed. When let me put it down, Aaron. When Saul was made king, he was anointed, and so was David, and so was Solomon. And these were all anointed because it is a symbol of passing on or delegating a sense of power and authority to these people. But we do read in Isaiah 45, right? Cyrus, for example, would come one day after this Habakkuk experience, after Nebuchadnezzar, after the Babylonian Empire had run all over Judah and they have wrested the land for 70 years. Then Cyrus appears on the scene, written or prophesied by Isaiah in chapter 45, verse 1. He is also called the Anointed. So that gives you a picture. Every time the word Mashiach is used, they are people who are used by God to bring about deliverance or salvation to the people of God. And that's how you would be able to see verse 13. You struck the head from the house of the wicked, laying bare the foundation to the neck, how God would come and rescue them through his powers. Again, we see another word, Shelah, and this is a pause. It's a musical term, I believe. Verse 14, you thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villagers. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. Okay, let me just briefly explain this. This is celebration like the poor. You know how the poor celebrate? They don't celebrate out in the streets. They celebrate in quiet. This is how this phrase is mentioned. And so all these people will be brought down to humility by God. And that's how verse 14 would be read in that picture. You walk through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters, and it's like God came and delivered them like the tsunami, right? So to speak. Okay. So now we arrive in verse 16. So let's take a look at verse 16 a little bit, because it speaks about I. And I would be how Habakkuk represents himself, and Habakkuk represents Judah, or the just of Judah, who seeks the face of God, and that's whom he is interceding. That would be how it's understood. So when I heard all these things, my body trembled. Now, first of all, I want us to think this through. The word body here would mean the belly as well. Okay, that's not how it's spelled. The belly, right? The hollow of the stomach, right? The belly or the womb. Tremble. The word tremble here is to quake. Very much like shaking in fear. Right? Shaking in fear. In this case, in fear. When we first read verse 2, it was God was angry, shaking in anger. Here, Habakkuk would be shaking in fear. Same word. So it really depends on the context. Then it says, my lips quivered. The how would you say this? The word quiver, it's like it's its quiver. That you know how when you are absolutely in fear, your lips are actually, well, lack of a better word, like shaking, trembling. That would be the way it is described here, right? At the sound of what is happening, at the sound of what he is hearing. Okay, it is like decay to the bones. That's what this word means. It's like decay to the bones. I'm not sure whether it's we could equate it as rheumatism, right? It's something that you cannot control, and it's entering into the bones. And I trembled at myself. Now, in this particular word, tremble, again, it is shaking in fear, right? It's being very agitated, right? That I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. This is now reflecting on chapter 1 and 2. How the Babylonians, or what in chapter 1 called the Chaldeans, on that day when it comes, he will be very afraid. And that's how he would respond to what God has said. Now, our last 3 verses is where I think we should just pay a bit more attention to. And the reason being is very simple, because it is a conclusion of his prayer. Verse 17, though the fig tree may not blossom. Now, I think the word blossom here is not quite the way it is described, let's say. Blossom in this case would be budding, right? Sprouting out, budding. Now, the fig tree buds this way. If you have seen a fig plant, or if you have bought a fig plant is a hardy tree, and if all the leaves fall apart, you need to know fig tree is one of those plants that the fruits do not come out from the flowers. And hence the Chinese word for fig is 無花果, fruit without flower. And the interesting part of a fig is that even though the leaves may fall off, the fruit may fall off, the way that the fig tree blossom is not that it has flowers. It sprouts shoots. So if this was the end of the branch, then at the very tip, you would find this is what we call blossom or sprout. And this sprout will then eventually come out and become a leaf or leaves. And that's how the fig tree blossoms. So you need to actually see the plant to understand that. So this would be the imagery that Habakkuk is actually expressing. So moving forward, he says that the fruit is not on the vine. This would be the produce. And when we talk about produce of the vines, we're talking about the grapes, of course. Okay. Though the labor of the olive may fail. It's not that the olive fails, but the labor of the olive may fail. Meaning, when they are collecting the olives, and how do they collect the olives? They don't. Well, they have a piece of cloth underneath the olive tree, and they would pick the olive tree, and the olives would fall down onto the cloth, and then they will gather the olives. Now, the labor of olives may fail actually means that they are denied and then if you expect a lot of olives, you can't get them. The fields, and this word fields would be the fields that's already cultivated. And so you can see it ripening, but it produces nothing to eat. Every time you see this word food, it is something, things to eat, right? Things to eat. Though the flock may be cut off from the fold, this would be the small, the sheep or the goats, right? The small animals, they are removed from the pen. Though there be no herd in the stalls, the herds here would be the cattle, the bigger animals. They're not there in the place where they graze. Now, this whole imagery, this entire imagery, is to say that when the Babylonians come and take over the land of Judah, for 70 years, there will be nothing there, because if you go back and read Jeremiah and Ezekiel, you'll find that God is resting the land while punishing Judah. And so while the land is being rested, nobody is there to cultivate, to grow, to harvest, and all these things will be left in the wild. And that is how Habakkuk ends his prayer. He's saying that although all these things may happen, that they are taken away, nobody is going to be around in the land, and nobody's going to enjoy the land, he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. And this is what I want to explain to you. The word rejoice. Rejoice would be to jump for joy. Okay? To jump for joy. That would be the way it is expressed. The second word, joy, it would be to spin around, right? Dance around. Dance around. And now let me just briefly explain to you some of the Hebrew practices. You see, in the Hebrew way, we have A and B again, saying the same thing twice. So for purposes of emphasis, the first word, rejoice, is literally to jump up for joy. The second word, joy, here is to dance around, spinning around. And I think you would recognize that in, say, 2 Samuel chapter 5, when David brought the ark back to Jerusalem. He was dancing around, and that would be the joy. And so in these two words, it is to emphasize the fact that even though there is nothing to celebrate in terms of harvest, in terms of animals, in terms of things that they are used to in the land, Habakkuk is saying, yet I will celebrate because of God he knows. In the God of my salvation, my deliverance. Now, God hasn't delivered him yet, because the eventual judgment by Babylon has not happened yet. And yet he is saying he is looking at God as who God is in his mind. Without having to see what is around, he knows what is going to happen. And yet in his mind and his heart of expression, that he sees and knows this God who is going to pass judgment on the land and the people, that he will one day deliver them, and he will rejoice. And finally, in verse 19, the Lord is my strength. And by the word strength here, this word here is, how should we say, my force. It gives a picture where you take something sharp like a horn and you drill a hole, that would be the picture of this word strength. This is God to Habakkuk. The Lord God is my strength, my ability to defend myself, my ability to rescue, right? And he sees God as providing that. He will make my feet like a deer's feet. That is another tough one that when we read it in English, it's like, why would you make our feet like a deer? Now, this would be a doe. Now, if you know the Sound of Music, it's doe, a deer. This is a female deer. Okay, a female deer. And when you talk about feet, this would be the female deer's uh, uh, feet, and I think you would find that this is with regards to the footing, a sure footing as a female deer. That would be how I think would be expressed. That God will make sure that where I walk, I will be safe. And that he will make me walk on my high hills. And again, it is talking about where I would tread, where I would, how would I say this? How I would tread. And in simple terms, walk, but it's not the normal word for walk. It is the normal word for going down a path, right? And the path would be on high hills. And high hills is where things are safe. And so what we would see in conclusion of verse 19 is about salvation, right? Hope, strength, and what else you can see here? Safety. And these would be the picture that is there. Our final line would be this. And most of the time, we actually don't care very much about that. But I think this is to the chief musician. And the chief musician would be a Levite. And let me just explain this to you. In the temple, we all know that the tribe of Levi is set apart to serve God. Aaron and his sons and all the descendants of Aaron would be priests. And so in the temple, you would find priests at work. But besides the priests, there are other sons who are not from Aaron, but are also Levite, from the tribe of Levi. And they will take care of the rest of the work in the temple. And in this case, one of those work would be the choir. The Levite would take care of the music. The Levite would play music. The Levites would sing. The Levites would be the ones that would bring merriment, or they would blow the shofar, and that's what the Levites would do. And so this is the chief musician who would be a Levite. And he is suggesting that it would be done by stringed instruments. Now, stringed instruments could be a harp, it could be a timbrel, but the idea here would be that the string instrument can play sad, as well as joyful, as well as exciting, as well as angry. So the string can actually express that quite well. And so he says to the chief musician, put this all using stringed instruments. And since this is a hymn, this entire chapter 3 could also be sung like a psalm, like 150 of those psalms. This would be one of them. And this is Habakkuk's prayer in response to chapter 1 and 2. I hope that you could see how the hymn would flow as a song. And I did not try to describe chapter 3 like how I described chapter 1 and 2. Although we did try to look at some of the words, but it is very much the picture picture and the imagery that is built in your mind that is expressed in chapter 3. And with that, we come to the conclusion of chapter 3. Now, tomorrow, I would like to spend a little bit of time to take one step back from Habakkuk 3 chapters and to conclude Habakkuk as how we would understand God and what God is expecting from his people, to know a little bit more about God from how Habakkuk interacted with God and how God expressed himself to Habakkuk. And that would be our conclusion for tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, we would start on the book of Amos. Okay.